Hello, this is Mike, and welcome to another episode of Urban Legends and Mythologies. I'm recording this on a very historic date in human history, April 12th. It's actually the 63rd anniversary of the historic flight of Yuri Gagarin. He was the Soviet pilot who became the first man to reach space. Traveling in a Vostok 1 capsule, he completed one orbit of the Earth on 12 April 1961 and achieved a major milestone in the space race at the time. He became an international celebrity and won many, various titles and medals. And, despite the politics of the time, this really transcended that. This was a time when humans, for the first time, would take space flight and go on to complete the next steps in what would eventually be reaching the moon and creating NASA, and even today creating SpaceX and all these other companies that are now on the way to exploring Mars. So with that being said, that really made me think of a previous episode I did, the Lost Cosmonaut theories. And back then, I pretty much just stated what the theories were and gave a general mindset of the average Soviet citizen in that time and era. However, I never really completed that to my liking. I wanted to get like an American view on it, and that got me digging down a rabbit hole of, the space race at the time, and it really is a fascinating murky kind of history, and that really made me start to think about the American propaganda in the space race and how that American propaganda played into these lost cosmonaut theories. And I think it's time that I revisit those theories and see what we can glean with kind of another perspective from where I was at back a year ago when I first recorded that first episode. So naturally, like always, let's start back at the beginning, the end of World War II, and Operation Paperclip, and the Soviets' answer to that operation. I still don't know that long freaking acronym. Like, whoever created the Russian language, they must have really hated English speakers, because I can't pronounce half of this Russian stuff. But anyway, Operation Paperclip, for those at the back of the class, was this kind of post-Nazi World War II program to go into Germany and bring back German scientists and German engineers to the United States in order to kind of reverse engineer a lot of the technology they were working on in 1945-ish. These projects would be things like the V-2 rocket project and rocket technologies, jet technologies, even things like hook and loop fasteners. This was a new thing in the 40s, and all kinds of other tech. And the whole point was to get an edge over the Soviets in this upcoming idea of a World War III. At the time, the American, I guess you could almost say it, empire was rising. We were rising as a superpower in the world, and we knew Russia was going to be our rival. So we were both in Germany, tearing through these warehouses, tearing through these factories, looking for anything that could give us a scientific edge over our competitor. And we have to remember that in Germany, in the early to mid 20th century, Germany is really the scientific center of the world. I mean, some of the greatest physicists and scientists come out of Germany, and they would go on to lead successful lives in the United States and in the Soviet Union as prominent scientists. I mean, Werner von Braun, I can never say that name. He's the father of NASA, the father of American spaceflight. And then his Soviet counterpart, Sergei Korolev, he was a lead Soviet rocket engineer and spacecraft designer during the 50s and 60s. He's regarded as many to be the father of practical aeronautics. He was involved in the development of the R-7 rocket, Sputnik 1, launching Laika, that dog, into space, Sputnik 3, the first human-made object to make contact with another celestial body. I mean, he was involved with Yuri Gagarin's flight and the Vauxhall 1 and the first person, Alexei Levinov, to conduct a spacewalk. He was involved in all this, so he's kind of the father of the Soviet cosmonaut program. And he achieves all these firsts before the Americans do, which is a big kind of key to all this that I've noticed. You know, all these early successes by the Soviet Union. Let's just start with Sputnik. That was launched in 1957. That's the first man-made object to ever orbit the Earth, and it's the first man-made satellite ever up there. And, you know, Sputnik caused a panic amongst Americans. Now, while Sputnik didn't really do much, it was, like I said before, it was basically a glorified basketball that belted out a radio signal that just said, basically, hey, I exist. You know, it really caused this panic because it made the Americans realize how far they were behind in this so-called space race. It's more of a pissing contest for dominance and superiority, but it really put our military on edge because if they're capable of launching satellites, what are they capable of launching next? Could they launch a nuclear warhead on the back of one of these ballistic missiles over to the United States and wipe us out? This is a real fear at the time during the Cold War, especially during the early Cold War, when the idea of the Soviet Union was probably going to go on forever. You know, it's not like post-1993 where it all collapsed and we live in a post-Soviet world today. Like, back in the 60s up until the, late 80s, the Soviet Union in most minds, in people's minds, was around to stay forever. It wasn't going to collapse in their mind. But I digress. In America at the time, as early as like 1951, von Braun, he was already making proposals for space stations, for human flight, for, stuff that would be the inception of NASA's early projects. However, the Soviets did get a bit of a head start because what a lot of people forget about the United States is a lot of these programs, like, you say you want to create NASA, for example, this stuff runs a little bit more slowly in the United States than it does in, like, the old Soviet Union, where they were just like, we want it, get on it, here's funding. In America, you pretty much have to beg Congress for that funding, and that's a slow process, and that did put a little bit of a delay on, the technological advances we had at the time. So naturally, with that being a thing, the Soviets were always going to be poised to make these first, like I said, Sputnik, the first satellite in space, Laika, the first dog in space, Yuri Gagarin, the first human space flight. They launched the first probe to Venus years before we launched anything to Venus. They were doing all this stuff pretty quickly and in rapid succession. You had tons of people working on all these projects at once. So, to an outside perspective, that may look like they are taking more risks and maybe lead to rumors of these so-called Lost Cosmonaut theories. And who would benefit the most from theories that, hey, maybe they were prematurely launching cosmonauts up there who were in ships that weren't quite ready yet in order to get an edge? That's good propaganda. But I think what the reality is they just had a few years head start in America where things run a little bit slower. Like I said, you got to beg Congress, you got to beg the public to get this funding because it's all funded by our tax dollars. And if there's one thing Americans hate worse than anything in the world, it's taxes. I mean, the whole foundation of our country is basically, big giant middle finger to taxes. So anything that the public hears that's going to probably increase their taxes, angers us and is usually slow to pass. It's kind of why we don't have things like universal health care in this country, but I digress. Of course, with all that being said, America did have a lot of early successes themselves. For example, right after Operation Paperclip, they were at the White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico in 1945, and they were assembling these assembled V-2 rockets, and these tests of these rockets actually led to the first photos of Earth from space. That was a thing that had never happened before. However, it's kind of hard to win a propaganda game with just photos versus, you have Gorlov over here and his teams, and they're already creating like the Vostok 1, well, the R1, the Vostok 1 would come later with Yuri Gagarin. But, they had other little successes like that. However, the primary focus in the 40s was more military. It was more about creating these ballistic missiles and these two-stage rockets that could send a nuclear payload over to Moscow if need be. So it was a little more on the hush-hush. It wasn't public yet, so public interest in that was probably a little low towards the end of the 40s. And a lot of this secret nature is what really pushes forth these conspiracy theories, because this is military technology, and in the 40s and 50s, this is high military technology. It's top secret stuff. So things like cosmonaut names, for example, weren't released until after spaceflight. Things like certain missions, the details weren't released until afterwards, because, you are in the middle of a military superiority pissing contest. So, divulging these names, divulging these details, any little leak like that, there could be some spy, in one of those agencies that's quick to send that information to one entity or the other. I mean, this whole thing is just rife with, Cold War spycraft. And I feel like Cold War spycraft really becomes a running theme of this series sometimes, because 9 times out of 10, it's always the US versus the Soviets in some crazy scheme for superiority, and let's just see where it goes every time. And personally, I've come to the conclusion while digging through all this crazy research of this murky time that, of course, these lost cosmonaut theories were going to come out, especially in the West, because if you can discredit the Soviet space program, if you could tell the international community, look, these people are dangerous, they're firing off rockets and capsules that aren't even proven yet with people in them, and people are dying, they're just murdering their own people, blah, blah, blah. If you could, take those rumors, and rumors turn into folklore, and folklore turns into history, it really gives a negative view of the Soviet space program, and that's how you win a propaganda war. I'm sure the American space program at the time would have loved to leap on any propaganda that discredited the cosmonaut program. And the reality is that these lost cosmonaut hypotheses are mostly just garbage when you look at it through the lens of American propaganda, or just Western propaganda in that sense. When you look at the actual science that was going on in the 40s and 50s, the Russians actually had a very well-developed program that was capable of doing some very miraculous things for the time, given the technology, and given that, Soviet technology would kind of get a reputation of, let's just say, declining in the subsequent years. It really is a testament to how intelligent and how great those scientists were. And I think that these lost cosmonaut theories really discredits that. Yeah, we know the idea of the Soviet Union. It was like, yeah, what were they doing? Firing a trash can on top of a V 2 rocket, you know? It probably fell apart in the sky, blah, blah, blah. But the reality is, it was actually here in the United States, NASA, they were the ones going with the absolute lowest bidder on getting these materials and building these rockets. And a lot of their early stuff was blowing up on the launch pad while the Soviets were conducting successful flights and tests. So I think that's an interesting thing to think about. Now, I don't like to knock anything America. I'm, hardcore American. I eat, breathe, and sleep American patriotism sometimes. But despite that, I think it's really interesting when you look at it from that perspective that, maybe the propaganda was too good and it led to this folklore and this image of, the cosmonaut program just being a bunch of copycat garbage. And if we can discredit, that program, we can discredit those historical flights and all those historical feats in order to win the space race, win the war. Of course, the space race would mostly come to a close with Kennedy and his assertion that we put a man on the moon by 1969, which we did, thus, quote, winning the space race. But when you really think about it, one victory, getting a person to the moon, yeah, that's a huge deal. That's, a historic event. But when you stack that one accomplishment up against the many accomplishments that were coming before it in the previous 2 decades, it really doesn't stack up all that well. It seems like the Soviets had the edge the whole time. Now, while we did eventually win the space race and surpass the Soviet Union in both technology and in these scientific feats, and hell, we even surpassed their ability to last as a nation, I think that without the Soviet Union and the Soviet space program, our space program would have never gotten off the ground, and we wouldn't be anywhere near where we are today with like SpaceX getting ready to launch their super heavy rocket, or all these other companies that are out there right now looking into new ways to exploit the moon and exploit Mars. I mean, in my lifetime, I will see a human on Mars, even if I have to be like 80 when it happens. And even in the next few years, we're going to see man walk on the moon for the first time in decades. Hell, for the first time in my lifetime. That's going to be an awesome feat. And we couldn't have gotten there without these early Soviet victories and all this crazy propaganda that came out at the time about these lost cosmonaut theories. Now, when you do go back and look at the theories, a lot of them were, I can say at this time, most likely bunk when you just look at them from a scientific perspective, because a lot of the theories involve these Vostok 1 capsules just kind of drifting off into space. And the sheer physics of that just doesn't make sense, because those didn't have secondary burn units, and they were just meant to reach low Earth orbit and, stay in low Earth orbit. There's no way you can, without a secondary burn unit, escape our gravitational pull. You just get stuck in orbit until you come crashing down in the atmosphere or burn up in the atmosphere. Now, there are some hypotheses that say that these early capsules didn't have great heat shields and burned up in the atmosphere. And while there were a couple of incidents where some Soviet flights ended with the tragic death of a few cosmonauts because of like heat shield failure. That really comes afterwards, in the mid 60s. And, there's no evidence that an earlier flight ever went up that was ever manned. The closest we get in a hypothesis comes from the experiment where they were looking at telemetry data and they had some dummies in the capsule itself. However, that capsule was never meant to re-enter Earth's atmosphere in the first place. It was meant to just orbit until it burned up in the atmosphere. And a lot of people say, well, there's these tape recordings. Well, those were pre-recorded to test various things like basically the radio. And I'm kind of repeating some of the ones from the past episode. If you want, you can go back and listen to those. I will warn you, when I did record that, it was the first thing I ever recorded, and I was super, super drunk off of some delicious Voodoo Ranger IPA. So it might be a little grating to listen to. However, just like that one, I didn't edit this one because I am literally recording it last minute, like the day before it launches, because it wasn't until today when I realized that this is the anniversary of that launch. So you're going to hear it the day after, whatever this month is, April 13th. And on that note, regarding the channel as a whole, for future reference, a lot of the future recordings will not be edited, or they will be extremely lightly edited. And that's mostly because I personally prefer the raw, unedited sound of these episodes. And yes, I am temporarily eliminating or putting a hiatus on the 5-Minute Tuesday episodes. If you were waiting for one of those to come around and wondered where they've been for the last 2 weeks. And that's actually because I'm working on a second show, and I kind of need the recording time for that to work into my work schedule, and the editing time as well, because that will be an actual really well edited show. It's probably going to sound nothing like this, but if you're interested in that, the launch date on it's to be determined. Hell, I don't even have a working title for it right now. I'm just doing the initial recordings. But on that note, I do want to thank whoever's listening to this for listening. And as always, if you do like what you're listening to, let me know, give me a shout out, tell a friend, maybe send it to a friend, spam their inboxes with my links, whatever. Have fun with it. As always, my show does grow via word of mouth, and without that word of mouth, it's basically just me sitting here talking to myself in a microphone, half drunk. And I think more people should be allowed to enjoy my drunken ramblings. So on that note, thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next episode. I've got a really good one coming up next time, so look forward to that.